Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Ontario Sheep Farmers Fall Speakers Series sessions. We just want to take a moment before getting started to highlight the sponsors of this year's Ontario Sheep and also the sponsors of this fall speakers session. With us tonight is Dr. Cathy Bauman, who will be speaking about lamb survival in intensive rearing conditions. This will cover the work she has done on colostrum quality and the impacts of newborn lamb survival. With us from Ontario Sheep is Anita O'Brien and myself. Feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation in the chat box. Both Anita and myself will be monitoring those, and at the end we will do our best to try and go through all of those questions. That being said, I'm just going to do a quick little screen share switch over to our presenter and give her an opportunity to take over the controls and also tell us a little bit about herself and the work she's done. So I'm not sure if you saw the request to come through, Cathy. If not, I'll resend.
It hasn't come through yet, Tom.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, there we go.
Perfect. And we see your screen now, Cathy?
Okay, and myself?
Yep.
Okay,
so maybe
perfect.
Before getting started, if you don't mind just giving us a little short introduction about yourself and some of the work you've done.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Anita. Hi, everyone. As Tom said, my name is Dr. Cathy Bauman. I'm currently at the University of Guelph in the OBC building, and you can find me usually in the Department of Population Medicine when it's a non-COVID season, but like everyone else, I'm kind of telecommuting from home at the moment. The university is all online, as most of you know who have university-bound or college-bound kids. And I do have to say that our research programs have really been drastically cut back. A lot of our industry partners, understandably, really don't want researchers on farm. So we had to limit a lot of our projects to the research farms that we have, or have just put a lot of them on hold. None of us have lost funding, so the province and the federal government have been really good about allowing us to delay our projects. So they will eventually get off the ground. It's just a matter of, I think we're going to wait and see how the winter goes and then proceed from there. So adjustments all the way around. So as Tom alluded, we were doing some colostrum work in sheep, and it's all sitting in a fridge and freezer at the university at the moment, ready to be run when we're allowed back in the lab. The university being what it is with the ventilation systems and whatever, and university students being quite high risk, they're very concerned about the spread on campus. So sooner or later we'll get back in and get that done. So I'm speaking from evidence from other studies, my experience with our big kid mortality project, and a bunch of other research that's been going on recently in the industry. So my background, I was in practice for about 15 to 20 years, small mix, emergency medicine, all the way around, and then decided foolishly with 3 kids to go back and start grad school and got a master's in public health. And the reason I did a public health graduate degree was really wanted to work upstream to kind of prevent a lot of the problems. I got really tired of seeing the same problems over and over again and really wanted to have impact higher up. So the MPH makes you look at things at a more population level and taking into account all aspects of the industry, and then really became fascinated with epidemiology. So prior to COVID, I don't think a lot of people knew what epidemiologists did, but that's what my PhD indicates, is I had further training in that particular area. So there's epidemiologists in human medicine, environmental health, animal medicine, and all it means is we have received extra training in how to analyze and look at data so that we can see the trends. So the trends that make better health and the trends that kind of lead to greater incidence of disease. So I'm going to come at this talk more kind of with my epidemiology mind as opposed to really my veterinary mind. So it might be a little bit different than what you're kind of expecting, but hopefully you'll kind of see where I'm heading and what I'm trying to instill in you guys as your own problem solvers. Because one thing I have learned is every farm is different with what causes mortality on your farms and what causes survival. And so if I can basically teach you how to problem solve and give you those tools, you can work either on your farm by yourself or with the help of a veterinarian or someone else in the industry to kind of improve your individual issues. So with that, I'll kind of jump in. So just a reminder, whether it's COVID or you're running into troubles on your own farm, this is kind of a thing we encountered in our own home when we had a big house fire. And so we got this sign, it's not about waiting for the storm to pass, it's learning how to dance in the rain and to laugh and to kind of still find some brightness in the dark times. It can be really hard when you're dealing with farm issues that are not quite going right to get really down. But one thing I've learned is during the tough times is when we really learn new things, we really relook at what we're doing. And why are we doing it this way? And, you know, for the better, I always come out the other end a much better person. So the lambs with the little blue coats, it's a farmer over in England, got tired of lambs succumbing to the rain constantly and being cold and hypothermic, and so created himself some little raincoats. So I'm not necessarily advocating for this, but just to say out of kind of some dark times really comes some ingenuity. So I'm just going to take you back, and when I was getting the talk ready, you know, as a veterinarian, I kind of come at things from the death side. How do we prevent death? And I know you guys are looking at it from a lamb survival aspect. And I'm kind of trying to bring them both to the middle and say, you know, we're kind of looking at both sides of the same coin. So the opposite of survival is obviously mortality or the death of the lamb, which is ultimately what we really want to prevent. And should always be part of the discussion is really looking at what's causing our animals to die so that we can then help prevent that and get them to live longer and with a better quality of life. This allows us to know kind of what to improve, and then we can target our management practices at those. Knowing that, though, I just don't want us to kind of limit our thinking to lamb survival. As we get better at it and we have greater survival, I really think our ultimate goal as producers, and I'm a producer as well, I have 30 ewes, is our ultimate goal is to kind of improve lamb thrival. So with that means reducing illness, improving their welfare, having them grow faster, shorter period of time, overall better health, so not just preventing deaths. The University of Guelph has really taken on the mandate of One Health or whole health. And so you're going to hear people trying to talk more about that human, animal, environmental interface as we go forward with a lot of projects in the future. So this is something you all know, I know. High lamb mortality is an economic issue. We have decreased revenue because we don't have lambs for sale, we don't have replacement ewes, and we don't have any breeding stock to sell if we have really high lamb mortality. I think the other thing that we don't always recognize is that we have also increased expenses if it's taking longer to get them to market because they're, you know, sicker and they're slower growing. But you also have higher veterinary costs. You have a vet coming out to your farm more often, more visits, and then consequently more drugs are spent. It's also an animal welfare issue, and I don't want to break this too much. I think we're all aware of it. Illness and death are painful. There's more public scrutiny of the food sources these days, so we just want to take that into account. And where they're concerned about is not always just pain and injury, but they're looking at, is the animal experiencing breathlessness like they might with pneumonia where they're struggling to breathe? Because anyone who's had asthma or a really bad cold knows how uncomfortable that can be to really struggle, and especially in these days with COVID. We all really understand that. But they're concerned about hypothermia, being too cold, hunger, and then illness in and of itself is a hindrance to just that overall wellness of being. And then one thing I just really want to acknowledge, and it's something that's really come home with me over the last couple of years, is that, you know, high lamb mortality or high mortality on any farm is really a mental wellness issue. So it can be one of two things. It can be a symptom, you know, high lamb mortality, not doing well on the farm, managing things. It can be a symptom of an underlying issue that's undiagnosed or untreated. You know, if we have depression, we're having a hard enough time looking after ourselves, never mind looking after the animals under our care. But high lamb mortality can also be the cause of mental wellness issues, right? I love lambing season. It's my favorite time of year, but it's also the time of year that I hate the most because it's a tear-jerking time, it's a worry time. So as I say, it could become a cycle where it's a bit of both. But I really think we have to acknowledge that it can really be hard on us whenever anyone's experiencing a high level of mortality. So again, whenever we're talking about loss, and you're going to hear a new trend in words called farm blind. It's really starting to become more popular in the welfare industry, and anytime we're talking about something not going quite right on the farm. I think for a lot of us, it's a defense mechanism to say we always lose a small number of animals every year, right? Because if we get too caught up and emotionally involved in losing everyone, that's really hard on us. But at the same time, we want to acknowledge that we can't accept that a large amount of lamb loss is just a normal part of the industry. So there's got to be a balance in there somewhere where we don't beat ourselves up too much about every loss. But at the same time, we don't become accustomed to, you know, a certain level of lamb mortality. I really think it's important for all animals, calves, goats, sheep, pigs, that we need to prioritize young stock health. Our livelihoods really depend on healthy young stock that grow up, are able to breed and last for a long period of time in the herd. It's hard to clear the problems up when these animals are adults. So we really have to start from day one with healthy animals, and then we'll end up with healthy herds down the road. So we have to really make that a priority. I think sometimes we don't always see the value in one lamb or one calf or one particular goat. But I think once we start to prioritize that, our mindset slightly changes. I don't know if this is a common knowledge, but young stock mortality is thought of at the higher level by a lot of people looking down and in, that it's a reflection of farm management. There's some things we can control, and we're going to go over that, and there's some things that are beyond our control. But we really have to scrutinize what we can change so that we can intervene and fix that. I really like the positive feedback loop. I've really worked with a lot of producers over the years that have had high mortality and how good they feel when they really reduce that, and how intolerant they then become of any mortality that then happens on their farm. So the less they lose, the less they want to lose, and it just ends up, you know, the momentum just carries them forward. So it's a really positive thing as a researcher, as a veterinarian, to really see that when someone's able to tackle and get their problem under control. So just to encourage you to hang with it, and once it starts to come, it really starts to accelerate. And again, I don't really mean to keep harping on death, but the dead lambs tell tales. I've been fooled many times before into what I thought was causing an animal to be sick or causing animals to be sick on a farm. And when we started cutting open the dead animals and systematically going through postmortems, I've been fooled many times about actually what was going on. So me humbly telling you, we're not always right about our diagnoses, and consequently, sometimes neither are the producers. We think we're seeing pneumonia, and it actually may be a starvation issue that we have going on the farm, and we'll get into some of that. So when you're stuck and you're not sure what's going on, I really encourage you, and even with your adult animals, when you're not sure what's causing some of them to pass, is to get used to doing postmortems on your farm. You can learn to do a basic one on your own. Your veterinarian can teach you. That honestly is not for everyone. but make use of your flock veterinarian. You can either have them out to do a quick single. I have people that put them in the freezer and then batch and thaw a bunch and do a bunch at the same time. If you're going to batch, though, try and separate them by age, because I'm going to walk you through how I kind of work up mortality, and it's always based on age. So try and separate them when you're having the postmortems done that way. The most common route to go is to send the animals off to the animal health laboratory at Guelph with the postmortem room. And I just want you to feel empowered that you do have control over the postmortem procedure. You can, and I want to empower you to make you feel like you have a choice. You can determine whether you just want what they call a gross postmortem. That basically they open it up, look at all the organs, and gives their gut feeling as it's pneumonia or diarrhea or what have you. And then you have the works, where they'll sample everything, culture it, test it for viruses, test it for bacteria. So you could be anything from, under $100 to $300 to $500. But that you need to have that conversation with your vet, or as you're dropping it off, about how far you want to go with each individual case. The other thing with the animal health lab, and I don't think a lot of people are aware of this, but you can also batch animals with them. And actually it's quite preferable. So you could send in 3 lambs or 5 lambs all at the same time, because again, if we're thinking of health at more of a population level than an individual animal, more lambs you can give them, the more they're able to tell from that. I'll give you an example with our kid mortality study on one farm. We picked up on one occasion 13 carcasses from this producer. And if we took the first carcass from that farm and just looked at that, it had pneumonia, and this producer was having quite a problem. We would have said, oh, it looks like it's just a standard pneumonia problem. 12 of the other 13 carcasses that we did after that all died of starvation. So the problem was they were getting a little bit of pneumonia, not enough that they could continue to suckle on the automatic feeder. And so they were dying because they weren't getting enough to eat, not because it was a pneumonia problem. So that's why I say it's better to do, I'm not saying to do 13, but something better than 1 is going to give you more information, because you may miss the problem still. And then just another thing with postmortems is what makes you sick isn't always what kills you. So just to keep that in mind. And the same thing, often a lot of things we submit for postmortem, we've already treated with antibiotics. So sometimes the bacteria that they die from, and we pick up on postmortem, is the one that's been lingering and didn't respond to the antibiotic, but it might not be the original bacteria that they got sick with. So some of that may be covered up with the antibiotic that's already been given. So just that there's some limitations, and that if you realistically know what we're able to kind of gather out of that information and what our limitations are, I think you'll kind of appreciate that we sometimes aren't always able to tell you what the cause of death was. With postmortems, they have to be done right away. The tissue starts to degrade and prevents us from knowing what went on really quickly, especially in the summertime. Or you need to freeze them as soon as possible. I recognize sometimes we go out to the barn in the morning and something may have died an hour after we left the barn the night before, and it's been sitting there all night, and sometimes we just don't have a choice with that. The other limitations with postmortems is there's a limited ability to diagnose diarrhea issues. Your best bet is to run fecal samples at the lab, fecal culture, fecal floats for parasites, things like that. We're not really going to be able to dig up a lot if you're having a big diarrhea issue on the farm through postmortem. And then, sorry, that picture came up a little early. It's a little bit disturbing to see it without the context, but it's really essential for you, your veterinarian, to provide the pathologist with a history, because it's essentially like blindfolding this particular person. They're doing the postmortem blind, and really their ability to interpret what they see is much better, more valuable if they have the background and they're able to interpret, did the animal stand, was it eating, did it have pneumonia, was it treated, things like that. So the more history you can provide, the more information you're going to get out of your postmortem. Okay, so getting a little bit away from the whole postmortem business, is I want to encourage you to quantify. I know a lot of you are already doing this, but for some people, it's still not a normal thing. And again, to denormalize mortality, we got to start measuring and actually looking at our numbers. So it's like looking at ourselves in the mirror to really see what's going on. You have to shake the mentality, as I've got there. If you don't count them, they don't exist, right? If I don't see them, I don't really have a problem. So once we've quantified, though, we also want to then take those numbers and compare them. But you don't want to be comparing yourself to your neighbor. You want to pick the right benchmark numbers to compare to, because you're seeing the worst on your farm and someone else is going to tell you kind of the better scenario on their farm, and it's going to leave you feel like you're not quite measuring up. So you need to compare what's going on your farm to the averages for the industry. These numbers are going to be different. So my numbers I'm going to share with you today are going to be different maybe than from what you've heard. And the reason for that is because some numbers include abortions, some include stillborns, some stop counting at weaning, some do it once they've gone to market and what have you. So take that into account with the numbers that I leave you. I'm not going to talk about abortions today, except in one particular circumstance you'll see. I'm not really going to talk about stillbirths because you've probably heard that to death. And then, so my numbers are going to be from birth. So basically they took a breath and they stood until roughly about 4 months of age, or you can look at it out to when they go to market. And then when comparing, I don't want you guys to berate yourselves. It's meant to motivate you and give you a goal to work towards, that not to get really upset that you're not meeting those. You may have a barn that you just can't quite work with, and it's prone to ventilation issues. So again, just to be easy on yourself, but still to have goals to work towards. So when it comes to quantifying, it's up to you. Again, data recording, I feel like it's a very personal thing, whether you want to do it with a laptop or a computer or just with a plain sheet of paper on a clipboard. This was one we came up with after a kid mortality study to help producers going forward keep track of their mortalities on farm. And again, we really like to break it down by age. So on the columns on the far right, we've broken it down to deaths within the first 48 hours, deaths within the first week, but after 48 hours, deaths from that time period until weaning, and then that period after weaning before shipping. So, and this is just an example of some animals that passed away on this particular farm. So we have lamb ID, so we can keep track of what mothers they're coming from, sex, litter size, birth weight, and so on, and then the time period of when they died. So ideally, after lambing season or once a year, you look back at these numbers and you can identify that risk period where you're losing the most animals, because that's critical, because we know there's certain management practices that we do during those periods that we can manipulate to improve the chance of our lambs surviving. Okay, so I have an example of this spreadsheet. I'm willing to share it with anyone that wants to keep it on farm. But for many of you, you're keeping track of births, and then you make a little note when something passes. I would encourage you to also keep a list of your deaths, so you can itemize them, find your patterns, and see where they're happening. So your goal is, we know we can't necessarily change this, so we know we can't change that, but we might be able to change something like the birth weights. Okay, better nutrition with the moms, things like that. Maybe, if we have some animals that are ending up too heavy as singles, maybe we can try and manipulate that so we have fewer singletons. And then looking at the patterns, maybe I'm losing more animals in the first 48 hours versus someone else who may be losing more if we've got the weaning to shipping. So again, change what you can control and change your response to what you can't. So for example, I can't change my litter size, but I may know that with my quads and my triplets that I'm losing more of them later on, and I may change my colostrum management of those guys, because we know when you have triplets or quads, the third and the fourth guys, there's not enough colostrum to go around for everyone. Okay, so we need to be spending more time getting more colostrum into those little guys. All right, so quantifying, finding the patterns on your farm. So my push for you, and I recognize there's a great deal of variability, is to really get lamb mortality as low as possible. But to start with, if you're having trouble, to aim for 7.5% overall between birth and when they go to market. And then I would break it down. So we want to lose less than 1% in the first 48 hours, less than 0.5% in that first week. We find we lose a lot in that pre-weaning group when they're still on mum, and then less than 1% post-weaning. So it's great if your numbers are already below that, but I'm just giving you a rough idea where kind of the biggest loss occurs in different age groups from what we've seen before. But your numbers, you may be having a really hard time in 0 to 48 hours and not losing any in your pre-wean group. So again, it might be something that you're doing correctly in the pre-wean group and maybe lacking a little bit in that first 48 hours. So we definitely have low mortality producers, less than 1% overall. And I know in our kid mortality study, we had one gentleman, one family that had 800 kids and they lost 1 kid in 12 months. That was just amazing, very impressive. And then we have farms with 20, 25% mortality. I know on the dairy goat side, it can be even higher, close to 35 and 40% on some farms. So it's a real struggle for some farmers, and so we do want to take it seriously. So when we talk about patterns, I was talking with, with the epidemiology strategy, what it is it's a study of patterns of disease, and then we're using these patterns to improve health. I have a picture here. Everyone knows Dr. Fauci. So I'm just trying to encourage you to be your own little epidemiologist on your farm to kind of identify your own patterns of disease. As I said before, the causes of death are very farm specific. So I can't tell you, for example, all cases of pneumonia are mostly due to mannheimia, and you should treat it with this antibiotic. On your farm, you're going to have different pneumonia-causing pathogens. So there's not going to be one antibiotic that we can recommend for you that's going to help you deal with that issue. So we have to teach you strategies so you can investigate the kind of the diseases that are occurring on your farm. You need to record your data. You need to analyze and look at your data. There's no point in keeping it if you're not going to analyze and look at it a couple of times a year. And like Dr. Fauci, you need to undertake diagnostic tests. So for him, in COVID, it's the nasal swabs and the antibody tests to figure out our different approaches and to figure out that we need to wear face masks. But with on the lamb side, we're kind of doing fecals and postmortems and other types of tests. So I'm going to walk you through now the different stages where we've really noticed of the high-risk periods. And I'm going to take this approach on the left-hand side where I'm going to give you the most common causes of death. And then from there, what in turn causes them, most likely to. And then on the right-hand side, in the shaded area at the moment, how best we can target those things that we can change with management practices. So I'm going to go through the 4 different stages, so less than 48 hours, and as I mentioned, all the way through. And then we'll walk back through it at the end to kind of come up with an overall flock health approach of during lambing season, how we would address that. So I think most of us wouldn't automatically, and this was a real surprise for me when we came out of the goat kid mortality study, was how big an issue starvation was. And can be on your farm. You're not thinking about it. A lot of the starvation is dystocia related or mismothering. So we often fixate on that, and it actually comes down to it. We have starvation issues. A lot of us don't recognize that when lambs or all young animals, when they're being born and they don't get enough oxygen, the impact that has on their brain. So dystocia often happens when you have oversized singles. So you have this big lamb, it's 14 pounds, it should be jumping out of the womb and running around the pen. And they'll come out with that big swollen head, the heavy eyelids, the tongue's all swollen. Honestly, I dread when I see those on my farm because I know they're a lot of work, okay? That poor little bit brain has been starved of oxygen, so they're slow. The nerve functions aren't shooting out to the muscles, therefore they're not standing, they don't have a lot of energy. That swollen tongue makes them not want to nurse right away. So we have to consider those as little special needs guys and need to give them special attention to make sure they're drinking, eating enough, and not just kind of fading away on us, because that can be frustrating. And then again, we can have anoxia or lack of oxygen with anything that has trouble coming out, more likely with triplets and quads, but, often that the first twin that got a little bit stuck on the way out, the little guy that's been waiting inside often has anoxia too, because he hasn't been able to breathe waiting for that brother to pass. We can have starvation though with trauma when they're coming out. We can have fractured ribs. I had, it's not funny, but there was a goat that had a traumatic, I can't remember if it was a shoulder blade or an arm that had broken on the way out and just couldn't get up to nurse and therefore passed away of starvation. It just broke my heart. But yeah, so something as simple as trauma. Lack of oxygen can also create hypothermia because the nerves aren't running to the muscles to get them twitching right away. They're more likely to succumb to hypothermia as well. So again, you may think it's just a chilling issue, but again, it's related to that whole lack of oxygen, reduced movements, lack of nursing. And then the one we're more familiar with where the mother doesn't take to the lamb, acknowledge it, and the lamb doesn't nurse right away. So it's really being on these, being aware of what you're watching for, knowing that you may have to give extra care to those singles or those guys that have trouble coming out, and whether we set them off in separate pens if they're mismothered or what have you, or put a pen with the mums that have had these troublesome guys and just keep a really close eye on them, mark them in some way. So we can help, we can, as we know, always prevent dystocia. We can try and minimize singletons. Sometimes if we use teaser lambs and get the girls ready before breeding season, it helps to minimize the singles somewhat by getting the ovaries a bit reared up. We can ensure ewes are adequate size for their first breeding to help prevent that, but we can't always prevent them, obviously. And then just timely checking of the lambing flock. To ensure that if they are having trouble, that someone's able to intervene in a timely fashion. And then again, just really focusing on that need for TLC for those brain damaged ones and abandoned lambs. So bottle feeding, and then really just that emphasis on learning how to stomach tube, okay? I just can't emphasize that enough. You need to get comfortable and be willing to do it even when they don't really, it may not even really be necessary. Starvation or low birth weight guys, again, tend to be more hypothermic, late standing, reduced udder seeking, and if they just never get going, they're most likely just going to fade away and stop eating. And again, it's more a case of starvation than anything, than them being born as a low birth weight. So again, preventing those low birth weights is really ensuring that we have high nutritional status in our ewes. So that starts with, ultrasounding them and identifying those ones with triplets and quads and separating them and feeding them differently than we would for the rest of the flock. Another thing that kind of bounces off that hypothermia is really ensuring that everyone who's involved with lambing on the farm is measuring temperatures at birth. You would be surprised how many animals have lower temperatures than you even think. They may come out, they actually look pretty spry, but if they have lower temperatures, they may start to fade away quite rapidly within that first hour or two if they don't get a drink of colostrum right away. So again, a lot of you know this, additional heat source, but you really want a heat source that has a fan associated with it. Animals dry faster if the heat is being blown on them as opposed to just radiated from a heat lamp. So if we really want to get them warm quickly, it has to be blown. Another leading cause of death during this age group is what we call septicemia. It just is a fancy word for an overwhelming bacterial infection. So if the bacteria are just localized in the lungs, we just call it pneumonia. If it's just in the intestine, diarrhea. If it escapes from one of those organisms and gets in the bloodstream and gets to the liver, we call it septicemia, but basically an infection that's just been showered to the entire body. When this happens in the first 48 hours, it's like a totally different cause from when it happens later on. At this age, it's mainly due to a colostrum management issue. Bacteria are more likely to escape into the rest of the body if they don't eat colostrum right away within that first couple of hours. They're more able to kind of wander around the pen and induce lick or ingest fecal material. And then that's the first meal that the intestines have, and then it showers the bloodstream with those bacteria. So really try and get that first meal of colostrum within the first 2 hours, ideally 50 mils per kilo, and then another 2 more meals within the next 22 to 24 hours. So we try to aim for at least 3 meals if you're doing the feeding, but obviously more on the mother, you'll have less control. Again, if you're doing the feeding, you want to be looking at your colostrum quality, or even just checking your ewes at the time of birth, just to have a quick squirt. The literature, again, we wanted to validate this, and I have the plates to validate it, and sorry, it's a COVID thing, it just hasn't gotten that far. But the literature has associated better lamb outcome when the colostrum measures 19 to 20%. But again, I want to give you more of a firm number, and hopefully as soon as we can get back into the lab in a couple of months, we can get that for you. And we know from reports in the literature that 16, 17% is associated with lambs of higher mortality. To improve this colostrum quality, it's really been shown that vaccinating the ewes with like a Tasvaxate or something similar 3 weeks before they give birth really improves that colostrum quality that's present in the colostrum and to the serum values for weeks after, and I'll have a graph to show you. But that really vaccinating the ewes 3 weeks ahead of giving birth, and I know, you know, with the lambing season, we can't always time that. It gives the ewe time to respond to the vaccine, build up the antibodies in her serum, so that when she gives birth, she's able to drive those serum antibodies into her colostrum. So we need enough time for her to really ramp up production of her own antibodies. If, for example, you have a ewe and you've checked her colostrum and it's of the lower percentage, it's 16, 17%. Saskatoon Colostrum Company, which is the main producer of colostrum replacement products on the market, has told me that for every 15 grams of colostrum replacement product you use, or add to your colostrum, it'll increase the Brix by 1%. So if you were 17 and wanted to get up to 20, you would put an additional 45 grams of colostrum replacement product into the colostrum that you have. Mix it really well with a whisk so that it gets dissolved and before administering. The Saskatoon Colostrum Company is a really good, conscientious company. They're making most of the colostrum replacement products are on the market currently, because a lot of the American companies, I guess there's quite a demand for colostrum in Asia as in makeup and actually ingesting as a naturopathic, homeopathic product. So it ends up that now Saskatoon kind of has, they're swamped, but are producing a large majority of the products, so made here in Canada. But recognize that sheep and goat colostrum replacement products are made with cow's milk. Okay, it's not made, not cow's milk, cow's colostrum. It's not made with sheep or goat colostrum. And I'll get into some of the potential repercussions from that in a little bit. So that's just touching a little bit on colostrum. The key is also navel dipping. And we sometimes, I know I get a bit lax with this. In calves, and I originally came from the dairy industry, dairy cattle industry, you know, if we didn't navel dip, we got swollen navels, they got infections, abscesses, and it was pretty obvious that it was related to not dipping of navels. We don't see that navel swelling in lambs and goat kids as much, but it doesn't mean it's the bacteria are still not entering. And we were able to see that on our postmortem study when we were actually able to look at the navel blood vessels and the navel umbilical architecture under a microscope, and we can see the bacteria just that had already entered through the navel. So don't kid yourself, they're still getting in, and I would encourage you not to drop this as a part of your management in your young stock. So this little graph is just to show you how vaccinating the ewes really helps the antibody levels in the lambs later on. So if you go to the left-hand side of the screen, this is the numbers up the side are the measure of the antibodies in the serum of the ewe. And so the dotted line is the ewes, the N equals 20. On the left-hand side are the ewes that received the vaccine, and the solid black line is the ones that were not vaccinated. So we can see the non-vaccinated ones, their antibody levels didn't go up as expected. And then the ewes that were vaccinated 3 weeks before they gave birth had that nice little peak before they even gave birth in order to manufacture those to put into the colostrum. And then as it's starting to go down is them starting to then send the antibodies into the colostrum. And then it starts to tailor off after a couple of weeks. So we can put that graph then next to what's going on with the lambs. So the lambs, the top curve that's really, really steep, those are the lambs that came from those ewes that were vaccinated. So we can see their antibody levels were really, really high. If we go across, it's at about 20. And then the bottom line are those lambs that came from ewes that weren't vaccinated. And you can see their levels start out at about 2 and drop to almost 0 by about 6 weeks after parturition. So the other neat thing to see here is the antibodies. So in the lambs, this is the antibody levels again in their bloodstream, how quickly they start to drop off and are almost at nothing between 7 weeks of age and 12 weeks of age. And so that becomes really critical too, which I'll show you later on, is that's a very vulnerable period because they don't really start to make their own antibodies until 6 to 12 weeks of age. So you've got that real low point where they're much more susceptible to infectious diseases. Okay, so another cause of death is pneumonia. Again, a really thing we're most familiar with. There's some animals that are just almost born coughing and huffing right from birth. And that's because these animals were born prematurely. They have immature lungs. They're already having trouble expanding them. But they're also more prone to infection. So any little bacteria that they may have picked up in the birth canal is going to get into those lungs and create infection. So if you're having trouble with pneumonia early on, you really shouldn't. Pneumonia should really come later on, you know, at that period when I said the antibody levels are really starting to drop. So if you're really having trouble at this age, I think you have an abortion problem, or you're having a lot of premature lambs because you have a lot of triplets or quads or something like that. We know when you have triplets and quads that the pregnancies are shorter. So some of those animals in that litter are going to have trouble breathing. The abortion hangover issue is something that was really noticeable on the goat farms. So if they had a Q fever issue or a chlamydia issue and they had a whole bunch of abortions, stillbirths, there's a small portion of those lambs that actually are born alive. They're premature, they're underdeveloped. And those guys, like I said, are very, very prone to pneumonia. So if you're having pneumonia in 0 to 48 hours, I would argue that's probably more of an abortion issue, and you really got to clamp down on getting your abortion vaccines up to date, or to start vaccinating. And then another one is just improper tubing techniques. So pneumonia in the first 48 hours, maybe you were stomach tubing and it went down the wrong tube and it went into the lungs instead of the stomach. So it doesn't happen very often, and it only takes one and to help you improve your technique, because you really regret it happening, if you feel guilty. Anyhow, so again, not common on a lot of farms, but it's easy to fix. And the farms that we've had trouble with and we addressed the abortion issue, dramatically reduced mortalities from 30–35% to less than 10% within the first year. So again, something really quickly that can be turned around. And again, just to warn you that even if they survive this 48-hour period with pneumonia and they're still kind of coughing and huffing a bit, is that they're at much more increased risk of starving because they're not able to suckle for a long period of time. They're going to suckle less often, ingest less colostrum each time, and then just keep slowly losing energy to the point where they start to starve. And lastly, diarrhea. We, obviously have other causes, but again, just talking about the most common one. It most often occurs in less than 48 hours if they're not getting colostrum right away. So again, knowing that it's more common in the triplets and quads, so that you're more likely to tube or bottle feed colostrum in these guys to ensure that they all have colostrum all the way around. And I think I've covered most of those things. Oh, the one other point, just on the right-hand side, I've got here where I've said feed colostrum for 2 to 3 days. If you have a really bad diarrhea problem within the first 48 hours, even though colostrum antibodies are really only absorbed in the first 24, the antibodies just existing in the intestine helps to prevent diarrhea for a longer period of time. So you feeding colostrum antibodies will increase their presence in the intestine and help to prevent the negative effects of diarrhea. So again, if you have the opportunity to do that, if you have diarrhea, I would encourage you. So in your toolkit during this period, you really need a thermometer. I was so surprised how few people in the dairy goat study were actually measuring temperatures. The more you do it, the more you're familiar with the normal temperatures on your farm, because an insulated barn is going to have higher temperatures in their lambs than maybe a non-insulated barn right from day one. So you can't always have a hard and fast rule that you would give a producer. You have to kind of give them a range for what's normal on your farm. You want to have your vitamin E and selenium, and really emphasize separate needles. I know it's hard. You don't always have enough needles on your farm, but you don't want to be sharing needles even from day one. Stomach tubing, get really familiar. I've seen some people using these almost like caulking gun with a tube on the end, and they're forcing the colostrum in. You really don't want to do that. You can overfeed some of these little stomachs. So you really want to have a 60 cc syringe that you're filling up with colostrum, multiple times, and allowing it to passively run through the tube into the lamb's stomach. And I'll show you the little trusty tuber that you can buy as well. Maybe many of you have them. External heat source, a Brix refractometer. You really want to have a stock of frozen sheep colostrum. The better quality, the better it is to have it in there. And then you want to have, colostrum replacement product as well. Then your skill set is having everyone on the farm that's involved with lambing know how to recognize dyssocia, intervene sooner than later. And you want to really be training all the staff to be taking temperatures and knowing how to stomach tube. I'm not sure if I'm able to play this. Anyway, I don't think my video is going to run today, but this is those nice little trusty tubers. I think you can get them from about $22 at UCal. I really like them. The tubing's really nice. Again, it has the passive opening that the colostrum is able to pass in. I'm sorry, I think I'm running behind, but I'll just quickly do that.
I think it's coming through now.
Okay. Tom, am I able to run over? I'm sorry.
Nope, you're good. I think now it's showing the video.
Okay. But this container has a nice little thing that just fits between your fingers, and it runs quite in. But yeah, you just want to be able to do it quickly, know it's in the right spot, so that you do it without even thinking. I can't get it. Move on now. Okay, so the 48 hours to 7 days, the rest of this is going to go quite quickly. Again, we're talking about those main pneumonia, diarrhea, septicemia. If you're having these same issues in 48 hours to 7 days, you really need to tighten up your management of first 48. You may have been able to limp them along, but then they give out during this stage. Again, this is where I say you really need that careful monitoring of the new moms or the bad moms or the guys that got off to the rough start. And you need to get into that pen and feeling for full stomach. So that nice little milk ball that you can feel, and just be going along and make sure that we know what they're eating, they have good fat coverage and what have you, because it can disappear quite quickly. And again, I need you to intervene rather than not. So extra bottles, topping them up, electrolytes if you need to. 7 days to weaning, again, probably one of the greatest periods of high risk on some of the farms I've been on. The pneumonia pathogens, it's the range. We have a lot of Mannheimia, a lot of Pasteurella, Yersinia. They can be really quite severe. They can be mixed where you have all three in one lung. So again, I worry, we're starting to explore looking at some respiratory vaccines. I don't think there's going to be a magic bullet for a vaccine. It may help to reduce the levels on a particular farm, but really there's something else that's underlying that we need to address. The ones that really scare me are the ones that are huffing. They're really like rapidly breathing. Those are the ones I don't do as well with. To me, they die quite quickly. And that's that acute respiratory distress that you hear of with COVID, where their oxygen levels go down really quickly and they decompensate, likely because they're also dealing with, failure of passive transfer or something else that was going along as well. So I don't mind the coughing guys as much. I know that they're probably more treatable with antibiotics. So the environment with these guys is we really need to be careful with bedding and preventing those ammonia buildups. All these animals are doing at this stage is they're drinking and they're peeing into the bedding. And then evaporated urine is what gives you that ammonia up in the air. So if you're down on your knees and you're in those pens and you're smelling ammonia, it's already too high, because our nose can pick up anything over 25 parts per million, and that's already a health hazard for your lungs, okay? You shouldn't be able to smell it, and then if you do, it's a problem. The ammonia, what it does is it burns down the protective barriers in your respiratory tract. So it burns the cilias in your nose, it burns off those little sweeping hairs in your trachea and in your primary bronchi, and it allows the bacterial pathogens to then come in much more easily. So bedding, because it prevents the urine from evaporating into ammonia to begin with. And then keeping that humidity below 80%, and I'll explain that as well, is really going to help cut down on ammonia. So I would get yourself some temperature and humidity monitors. They're not expensive. I can leave the link with Tom and Anita. There's a company down in Cambridge you can easily pick some up with and monitor your own barn. I just want to caution ventilation. We're always into making changes. Do it with someone who's experienced. Don't just buy a tubing because you think you need it, or certain fans. Really have an analysis done of your barn to figure out where you need to. Again, it's very farm specific, so knowing what you need to change. And then just to caution you, I know we all have overstocking issues at different times of the year, but there's no ventilation system that can overcome that can get you through an overstocking problem. So we can have a ton of lambs, and no matter how many air exchanges we get going through there, it may not clear the problem up. So just as a caution. Diarrhea, so again, really to encourage you to do those fecal tests, bacterial culture, or the test for parasites. And to really be aware of when this diarrhea is starting in certain age groups, because that kind of tells you what the pathogen is that's causing it. We know it's usually E. coli or Clostridium in really young animals, but for parasites, crypto starts to show up as early as 7 to 10 days, and that's really profuse. And then Coccidia is not typically before 3 weeks. So things that you can manage, I hate crypto. I dread getting crypto on my farm. You really want to prevent it from entering to begin with. So if you don't have it, it's another reason not to be bringing a lot of animals in, because you risk bringing it in every time you buy young animals. And then it's really a pain to get out of the environment once you have it. So just a real cautionary tale. Coccidia, all animals have it, all ruminants, and it's just minimizing that transitional stress that you have when you're feeding. So anytime you're having a stress as we're weaning, moving animals is when they're most likely to break with coccidia. The other aspect is when you're lambing, it really builds up in the environment. So the guys that are born later on are more likely to contract it from the lambs that are older than them. So again, I really don't know how people get by without not having decox in their feed during transition periods. I can't live without it. And then if you're going to use Baycox, do it early, but not too early. So we don't want to just pre-treat everyone that doesn't have it. Doesn't give them an opportunity to build up immunity, but you want to give it to them early enough that they don't start to not be feeling all that well, or that you get into too big an outbreak. Okay, enterotoxemia, again, sudden death, Clostridial perfringens, what we vaccinate for. And then just to remember, it's the toxins that are causing the problem, not the bacteria themselves in the intestine. So lambs and goats, it's very common to have Clostridial perfringens in their feces. It just gets really upset anytime their diet gets thrown off. So I feel like there's this big cycle, the diet gets thrown off, Clostridium overgrows, and then Coccidia overgrows. And I've yet to figure out which comes first, if it's the Clostridium or Coccidia. And I think that's a really interesting area of research we really need to explore, because then we know which to treat first and to kind of peel back the layers in the onion. The reason I tell you it's the toxins and not really the bacteria that's causing the issue is toxins act really quickly to cause death suddenly, and that's why you see the sudden deaths. So anytime we have a foodborne illness where you eat something that's not good for you and you get sick the same day, it's because you've ingested a toxin, like a shellfish toxin or a Staph aureus toxin from ingesting bad ice cream or something. And other food poisonings take longer to unfold. So just, again, that's the reason why this is such a quick, sudden death, is because of the toxins. And that's what the vaccines target, is those toxins as well. So to know that we really need to keep the immunity up of that animal against those toxins, and that we're in a way, by introducing the starchy diets earlier on, not too high, but if the sooner they're eating creep, it's allowing them to build up some immunity to some of those toxins. To just let you know, even though some animals, their moms were never vaccinated for Clostridium, they still have antibodies, and it's because they're getting exposure through the diet. Again, we want to vaccinate those ewes because it's still protective into this early part of this period. Again, we talked about the drastic feed changes. And one thing I've really come to notice is really wherever you have feeders for creep and those guys that are really starting to take off and grow and eat a lot, is really keeping the area under those feeders well bedded, so they're not getting into some of that moist feed that may have fallen and get them trampled on and get wet, because we've really noticed that that can accelerate the enterotoxemia as well. The first Clostridial vaccine should be given at roughly 10 to 12 weeks of age. But if you're having Clostridia problems before then, you need to keep moving your vaccine schedule 2 weeks earlier until you're able to compensate. It's not felt like that animals can respond to vaccines any earlier than 12 weeks of age, but there's some new research that's come out in this past year that shows that vaccinating even at birth, and I'm not encouraging you to do this, but that they can mount an immune response. Okay, so this blue bar here indicates the antibody levels of a lamb that was vaccinated at birth. The purple bar down below here just receives the adjuvant, which is the immunostimulant in all vaccines. And then this white bar is an animal that just received some saline. So this is 2 weeks after birth. We're already seeing that they've had a little bit of an immune response. It's not protective. It needs to be over 2 to be protective. And then we can see at 4 weeks out, they're still having a bit of an immune response. So the belief is starting to change about when we think these animals have the potential to respond to vaccines. So this may be something that we update with you over the next year or two about when to start really vaccinating. So the label on the package says 12 weeks, but I would say if you're having trouble sooner, like I said, move it ahead in 2-week increments, because the lamb needs 2 weeks to get those antibodies built up after it's been vaccinated. So again, coming back to septicemia and the overwhelming bacterial infections, here's a little graph of antibody levels in the lambs from birth to about 12 weeks out, I believe. And the different lines just indicate the different levels of antibodies in the colostrum that they were fed. So the lambs with the dotted line at the top and the open circles got a colostrum with a higher level of antibodies. So I think it was 8 grams. And then the next group down got 4, and then the next group down got 2. So the main reason I just want to show you is you can see again how quickly the antibody levels taper off as we're getting out to 12 weeks out. Their antibody levels drop below 5, which is not protective for this particular disease. And then that's when they're really, really susceptible. So in this age group, it's really important to identify and treat infections early. And like I say, even 2 to 3 weeks out can be a real period where they're vulnerable. Jumping to the next age group, weaning to market age. I find deaths in this age group really painful because like you almost got them there and then you lost them. But I feel in this age group, it's a little bit like this kids game, this stacking game. And like the first row is like the first week of lambing and we had a few issues, and then the next level is the next age group. And I feel like by the end of lambing season or getting close to market, I've got all these things I'm trying to juggle and hold in place that it's no surprise when you lose the occasional lamb here. And I have people that approach and say, I'm really having high mortality weaning market age. I'm not having any issues in those younger animals. Just tell me what to do in this age group to fix my problem. And again, I know it's hard when you're not having a lot of mortality in the other age groups, but you have a problem earlier on if you have mortality still in this age group. And with every problem of mortality in lambs, I make people go back to the beginning and what are you doing here? And what are we doing there? And what does this look like? And just still keep walking them all the way along. So even if you don't have mortality, if you've got ill animals in those earlier age groups, it's leading up to you having an issue still in this group. You really need to get that second vaccine in this age group. So remember I said we're getting that first one in hopefully between 10 and 12 weeks of age. If we only give one vaccine, you're going to see the response that you see in red. The antibody levels are going to go up really quickly, and then the antibody levels are going to drop away and almost completely go away. The secondary response is that after we get the second vaccine, so we've had at least one exposure, within that next 6 weeks, we give that second vaccine, that antibody response goes up and stays up. Okay, if we give the primary vaccine and just boost and don't give a booster, and then we vaccinate again 6 months later, we get that same exact red line again. It never goes up into the blue area. And then I vaccinate once a year at 2 years of age and 3 years of age. All I'm doing is just repeating that little bump. You got to get your vaccines right from the get-go. 2 vaccines, and you can even do this later on if you want, but you need 2 vaccines 6 weeks apart to get that high immune response that we really need to have. One thing to keep in mind though, that vaccine for clostridial disease, you need a 3-week withdrawal period. So to keep in mind when you're staggering your vaccines. So again, if you're dealing with pneumonia, consider sending a couple for postmortem to identify the pathogens that you're seeing on your farm and the most likely antibiotic that might respond to those. You have to recognize that chronic diseases wear the immune system down so that they're going to be more susceptible to other things. So if they had diarrhea and then something else, and then pneumonia is the thing that maybe takes them down. And then you're going to somehow need to tease out the role that Madevisna may be playing in all of this if you have that circulating in your flock as well. Pneumonia, especially in the older age groups, is really sensitive to weather fluctuations. The weather itself doesn't cause pneumonia. It affects the temperature and humidity, which affects the bacterial load in your barn. So when we're talking about environment and ventilation, our goal is to have like those 4 air exchanges per hour. What that's actually doing is removing dust particles, okay? It's, dealing with humidity as well, but the main thing is getting rid of that dust in the air, because dust particles are actually mold spores. And they're just really light particles that are floating in the air. They never settle, and so the only way is to pull them out or to blow them away. And I just wonder what you think the worst offender would be for dust particles and mold spores. So a lot of us would probably think it's bedding, like sawdust or the straw, but actually the worst offender is moldy hay. So it's almost twice the number of spores come out of moldy hay than comes off of just good straw bedding. So most spores are really small. They're less than this 5 micrometers, which means they float. And when they're this small in diameter, that means they're very easily inhaled into the lungs. Our noses are really good at screening out larger particles of dust, but these spores really, once they're inhaled, they go right into the lungs. These spores that float in the air, they allow bacteria and viruses to actually live on them. And where the issue comes in is when the humidity levels are above 80%, bacteria live, thrive, and can grow on those really small spores. So high humidity means I'm inhaling spores with bacteria on them right into my lungs. So more likely to get pneumonia in high humidity environments. Higher temperature also increase bacterial survival. So worst case scenario is high temperatures accompanied by high humidity, okay? So that's why sometimes you get pneumonia in the summertime, and then the higher humidity you often see in winter exacerbates pneumonia problems as well. So ventilation as well, and then minimize the overstocking. So that little graph I've got there, it's a line that's going up. So on the left-hand side is your temperature, and then the little dots is the increased bacterial growth. So the bacterial concentration is going up and is more pronounced in temperatures in the barns that are above 18 to 20 degrees, and as high as 28 degrees. But they really start to accelerate in growth above 20 degrees. Okay, so almost done. So our timelines of opportunity, we have an idea when our lambs are going to be born. We know our risk periods and our diseases that happen during each of these periods. So if we back that up, we want pre-breeding to have our abortion vaccines if needed. We want to be ultrasounding and body condition scoring are used to ensure they have adequate nutrition for their babies, separating out the mums that have triplets and quads and feeding them a bit more. 3 weeks out, we want to be vaccinating the ewes for clostridial diseases and really cranking up the antibodies so we have really good colostrum to feed the babies. And then in that first 48 hours, we really want to be aware of those guys that had dystocia issues and ensuring we get the colostrum in ASAP, a good couple of meals. For that next week, till they're a week of age, need to watch the rough starters, give them some help when needed. Between 7 days and weaning, we want to make sure we're vaccinating for clostridial disease and making sure the ventilation is good. The animals are getting bigger, the pens are starting to get overcrowded. And then in this age group, again, watch the overstocking, ventilation, the diarrhea, and ensuring we're getting that second vaccine, especially in our replacement ewe lambs 6 weeks later. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say your management really directly impacts your mortality levels. And your desire to change is really influenced by your belief that it's going to result in a favorable outcome. So you really have to buy into what your vet or whoever is telling you to make that change. It's also influenced by your perception of what others are expecting of you to do. What's your neighbor or your relative or your dad who left you the farm? Is that social pressure that you're getting from other people of what they would do or how they did it before. And then your perceived belief that you can accomplish the behavioral change. So I think there's a need for potential research in a lot of areas. I really want to explore this impact of vaccinating younger animals and stimulating their immune system. There's been some work in llamas that were given bovine colostrum that said their antibody levels were initially high enough, but that they cleared out of the system sooner because they were foreign. So I really want to explore if that's a reason. Sometimes these lambs that get off to a rough start that we're hand feeding bovine colostrum to maybe don't do as well. It could become an immunity issue. I need to also kind of figure out a way how we can deal with and help these immunologically vulnerable guys that either had a lack of colostrum or had got off to a start with bovine colostrum. And again, as mentioned, teasing out this Clostridial coccidia relationship. I've applied for funding with a veterinarian at West to bring in a UK respiratory vaccine for use in a feedlot. And I think if it seems to be working well, we would then adapt it and explore a study here in Ontario on farms. And I really feel after the kid mortality study and what I've seen on some lamb farms, that the Q fever vaccine, we really need to prioritize and work to get this one approved here in Canada. It's just crazy that you have to have a certain level of abortions before you can get it on emergency release. And in my opinion, it's an animal welfare issue and it's causing all these deaths in the young animals. Anyway, thank you for taking the time to listen in. I hope I've been able to give you at least one tidbit that you've been able to take and use on your farm, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, so just be one moment while we bring up the chat box. Thank you, Cathy. That was a great presentation. Anita and I are going to now field some questions out of the chat box. If anyone wants to type some others in, feel free to do so. We're monitoring both the chat and question box. And if you want to ask a question, we can also try doing that if you indicate by raising your hand, we will get to. So Anita, are you there?
Yes.
Okay.
So there are some questions in the question box, and I will try and ask them based on when they were asked. The first one, Cathy, was a request to you for a source of information for non-infectious causes of stillbirth and mummies. So someone's looking for a source of information rather than you describe what some of the causes are.
Oh, we have you on mute, Cathy. If you just
Sorry,
there you go.
If you want to share your email with me, I'm happy to share some sources with you. Definitely not as common. If you've submitted them for processing at the animal health lab and they haven't picked anything up, then you're definitely right. It's a non-infectious cause, but I'm happy to dig up a couple of things from the literature I have access to and share them with you.
The other one I answered in the chat box, but just to verify with you, when you were talking about the animal health lab in Guelph, there is also an animal health lab in Kemptville.
Yeah.
There is none in Northern Ontario. Is that correct?
I don't believe so anymore. There used to be.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can figure out what the current recommendation is from up there. I have a couple of colleagues up that way.
Next question. This referred to your slide when you were talking about navel dipping. How soon after birth should the navel be dipped to avoid any issues?
So as soon as you're there, you know, as long as it's bleeding and it's still very fresh, it should be dipped. If by the time you get out there and it's dried up, it essentially is closed off itself. But as long as it feels wet, it should be done immediately, ASAP. It would be the first thing I would do. You know, the process of drying off and dipping.
Sort of along with the colostrum or even before colostrum?
I would do it before colostrum. Because, you know, oftentimes you're there before they've even stood. So I would do a quick squirt try and get them really invigorated, get the muscles moving, warmed up, so that they're able to stand. The more you invigorate them, the more likely they are to want a nurse.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is with respect to vaccinating the ewes before lambing. What happens if they're vaccinated earlier than the recommended 3 weeks pre-lambing or later than that? And their challenge is the ram is being left in for 3 heat cycles, so that would be 50 some days.
Yeah.
So what would your recommendation be in that situation?
Absolutely, and it's, you know, it's obviously a real world. In the real world, it's a lot different from what we see done in the lab. So I'm giving you information from a study that was done, and it's done in a very controlled fashion so that they know that the evidence is correct and it's not biased in any way. So the study they did was they exactly measured them out 3 weeks, and so they know that that data is representative. But in our situation, when we never know when someone's exactly pregnant or when they're going to lamb, we have to just, you know, be a bit more general and a bit more liberal. I would do roughly a month before kind of the middle of the road where you think most of your lambs are going to lamb out, and I would count back a month and do it then. Here, you know, there's been no studies to say if 4 weeks or 6 weeks or anything is going to have a greater impact. And it's just, you're going to be somewhere on their curve. Some are going to be a little lower and some are going to be a little higher. But to me, the benefit of just even giving it far outweighs not giving it at all. And, you know, you can't pick out certain sheep that are further along in their pregnancy as others, right? You want to just run them all through a chute. So you're just going to have to come up with the time, and it's just better that you're doing it as opposed to being too worried about being exact with the time.
Cathy, what's your comment on in a situation where the ewes have been exposed for 3 cycles and lambing is going to be prolonged, that you go in and vaccinate again anything that hasn't lambed by day 30-ish? I mean, I just pulled that number out of the air, but
yeah. So we would have vaccinated the first. So they're talking about vaccinating twice.
Yeah. So the ones that haven't lambed, that are still the tail enders,
yeah,
go back in and vaccinate them again.
No, I don't think there's any benefit. Okay. I would just do them once and recognize that some are going to get more of a benefit than others. And I wouldn't go to the stress of vaccinating them a second time. I don't think it's good for the sheep to be stimulated too often in that stage of her pregnancy and handled again. So no, I would just do the once. You know, it is what it is, how far out it was. And again, giving it, you know, at 8 weeks, you know, prior to giving birth is better than not giving it at all.
Perfect. The next question deals with your discussion on lung conditions, particularly with lambs that may have been premature. Is there any recommendations to treat those early lung issues? And the question mark was with respect to dexamethasone. Right.
And so we know that dexamethasone is of benefit in those acute respiratory distress guys, but it is hard to pull those guys around. So don't beat yourself up if the dex doesn't work in that situation. There hasn't been a lot of work done with respect to dexamethasone use in the preemies. I would have to dig into the literature a bit for you. The research that has been, like, it's a relatively new finding that we can associate pneumonia with the preemies because of the immature lungs. So it's never been shown before that we actually found Q fever in the lungs of some of the goat kids. So we knew it was the problem. The literature that's out there on the use of dex is going to be because a lot of the lambs are used to study premature lungs in humans. So I could dig that out for you to increase your chances of pulling those guys through. I'm just not sure. I would try it. I'm just not sure of the dose, and you can talk it over with your vet, but I can pull you up a research paper.
Okay, thank you. Next one was when you were talking about coccidiosis, and I believe this was in the very young lambs, perhaps up to 7 days. There was a reference of having decox in the diet, but also a reference to Baycox being used. So the question was, would you use Baycox even while lambs are on decox or feed with decox in it?
I think that's a conversation for with your veterinarian, because I'm not sure what the levels you have. If you had rumensin or a monensin product, I would definitely use Baycox. But you need to make sure Baycox has a very low threshold of safety. So you need to talk to your veterinarian about your levels of decox to make sure that there's not going to be an interaction effect.
Yeah. The next one, sheep-based colostrum. Is it available in Ontario or just the dairy cattle colostrum?
Oh, in Canada, it's only, I don't know anywhere that has a sheep or goat colostrum-based product. It's all bovine.
Yeah.
It would be a lot of work, to be honest with you, to harvest colostrum from sheep and dehydrate it and to make a product, unfortunately.
So our next, actually, I think the last 3 questions all are with respect to navel dipping. Is spraying or dipping the preferred method is one of the questions.
You're sure. And Anita, can you just remind me, I want to go back and touch on something with the colostrum after.
Sure.
Okay, but I would spray. I think you can get a better soaking and get that whole navel. Dipping, I sometimes worry about if we're infecting the cup with a previous animal's fecal material. It's much more easier for that to get contaminated. And I just think it's easier to really drench that navel if you're using a spray.
Okay, so dipping is preferred over spraying.
Or no, spraying is preferred over dipping.
Spraying is preferred over dipping, yeah.
Yeah, just because it's sometimes really hard to get that navel in and really.
Okay, the next one, producer uses a lot of straw embedding. They dip navels, but they still get joint ill. Are there other tips or causes? Like what would you look to as to possible issues there?
And maybe they can help me out, are they using a lot of colostrum replacement product? And again, when is the joint ill occurring? This is a big problem that we have in dairy goats, and in the UK, they're having a really big problem. We got contacted by a researcher from the UK asking about, are we having as big a problem as they're having? It seems to be becoming more prevalent. I don't remember seeing joint ill like this before in sheep and goats. It used to always be a calf thing. So I would ask this producer, have they got good, are they checking their colostrum quality in their ewes? Or are they mainly seeing the joint ill problem on those guys on colostrum replacement product and milk replacer products?
Would the age of the ewe play a role in there as well, i.e. younger ewes having lower quality colostrum?
Yeah, and so we've done work to see if there is an age relation to colostrum quality, and you would think just because of environmental exposure, older ewes, and there is a slight trend, but there are some young ewes with really good colostrum, and there's some older ewes with really bad, and it has to do more with their immune system. So I can't make a blanket statement about age and colostrum quality. Are they saying that it's occurring in ewe lambs on the mums?
The question was general, not specific. Romy, if you want to comment further on that in terms of, are you seeing it more in your younger ewes versus older ewes? We can address that. Various age ewes generally good on colostrum.
Generally good if they're
bricks. Yeah.
So one thing I just want to share with you, there are some pathogens in cow colostrum and cow milk that can sometimes cause joint ill in lambs and kids. So we've cultured some struts and some other kind of bacteria associated more along the line of cow's milk. So again, really handle that well. If you're making a milk replacer and colostrum replacer, to make sure that you're using it in a prompt fashion. But just to warn you, I think it's related more to the bovine source products, is my gut feeling.
Okay.
Not to say they're bad, but that just occasionally there can be a bacteria there. And also, I would say, wonder if it's in an automated feeding system, because that can seem to accelerate the growth of those bacteria.
And our last one is, can you comment on whether trimming navels is a preferred practice or leave them as they are?
If when they're standing, they're at least, 8 inches above the ground, you can leave them. But if they're coming in close contact, they're hanging down low enough that they can come in contact with any bedding, I would trim them back. I do not make a routine practice though, because how often do we clean our scissors and the things we use? So be really good, putting alcohol on them before you're trimming, like a human baby you would do. That's just a direct blood source into the intestines and the rest of the body. So anything that comes in contact with it has to be cleaned.
And I guess from my perspective then too would be, is there a risk of trimming too close? And if so, what would be the recommended minimum length?
I would still leave 2 to 3 inches for it to dry off.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just address the colostrum thing, Anita?
Yes.
When we're talking about the cow colostrum, to recognize that cows are not, especially dairy cows, are not routinely vaccinated for clostridial disease. So that means there's very little antibodies in that colostrum and hardly anything in the milk replacer. So anybody that's being reared artificially is very vulnerable to clostridial disease. And
I think that may be news to a lot of folks.
Yeah. So
yeah.
To me, I don't know how we're going to fix that, but just to make you aware of the problem, because dairy cattle, it's hard to find a window to give them any kind of vaccine. And the priority from a dairy farmer's point of view would be, it might be a respiratory disease or for BVD or something else. Their priority is not clostridial disease. They don't have a lot of clostridial disease in cows. So that colostrum is going to be deficient in antibodies specific for clostridial disease. So that's why we can vaccinate them earlier and at least give them some protection. I can't tell you, I don't want you to waste your money and it not be effective. So that's my next step, hopefully on the research side, is to be able to answer that question for you.
Yeah. And I guess on that topic, for some producers, the majority of their orphan lambs or surplus lambs would be maybe the ones that are more likely getting commercial colostrum. So maybe a practice would be to implement a vaccination program for those surplus lambs at least.
Yeah, and the key is just we're still not sure how quickly their immune system can respond. If we knew from day one that we vaccinated, they absolutely were, like the work that I showed you where they're responding. It wasn't a clostridial vaccine that was used for that study. It was something else. But so I think we need to put money towards investigating if they can respond to that clostridial vaccine right at birth or even at 2 weeks. But I think even half the problem is making you aware of the issue in everybody's mind that that's a vulnerable population. And we need to, perhaps watch them a little bit more carefully, that they would be more prone to clostridial disease.
Okay. So there was a question with respect to that. Colleen, I'm assuming that Cathy's answered your question with regards to vaccinating our artificially reared lambs. There's one other one here. It's shifting gears a little bit, talking about chlamydia vaccine and it's being on back order.
I know. This is my biggest pet peeve is encountering things like that. It's very frustrating from our endpoint when we're, our sources can't provide them to us and we have to turn around and tell you, you need it. It's a priority. And I don't know how to fix this problem. And again, I think it's something we need to make our government officials aware of, especially the Q femur one. It's really frustrating. So I can imagine how frustrating it is on farm.
Yeah, always a challenge when stuff that you expect isn't there.
And it works, right? It works.
Yeah. So here's a comment again on the chlamydia from a producer. Our veterinarian got a new vaccine from Spain. Something to look into for others.
Okay. They probably got it an emergency release as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess, and again, if there is a back order, it's pretty hard to do anything about it. But if you know that you're going to be using some of these vaccines, like they generally have an okay stale date on them, maybe working with your veterinarian to get them way earlier than when you actually need them, or staying on top of the back order that's there right now and trying to get them in as soon as you can. But yeah, for sure frustrating.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was the last of the questions. Awesome. Tom, okay. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Not too much information, and I hope it wasn't too repetitive for some people. I know for an experienced producer that's been through a lot, there's nothing really new, but just emphasizing from my point of view, if I can just, get you in that mindset of how you work these things up, categorizing into groups, and then matching that with the management practices you would associate with that age group, then that's really what I would like you to take away, just so that when their levels are starting to go up, where you need to look. And be open to re-looking at things and trying new things, no matter what others tell you.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Cathy, for presenting tonight. We certainly welcome having you here and kicking off the fall series of speakers. Just want to close by doing a quick little shout out to the sponsors on our screen who have helped make events like tonight and the next few weeks possible. And again, thank you to all of our participants who took part in the presentation tonight, and hopefully see a lot of you at the ones coming up in the next few weeks. And just to remind everyone, if you're looking to see when the next series of speakers are speaking, visit our events page on the website. And thank you everyone for joining us. And again, thank you on behalf of the Ontario Sheep team, Cathy, for spending time with us tonight.
Anytime you want me to talk about something, I'm more than happy. You're a great group.
Perfect. Well, I'm glad we've got that on record too. Thank you. And we will be posting these on the webinar library. So if anyone wants to look in the future, within the next few days, it should be on there. So thank you, everyone, and take care.